We're going to start. My name is Fanny. I'm the policy director at the AI Collaborative, which is an initiative of the Omidyar Group. And I'm not a morning person, and I really appreciate your being here. You all deserve a medal to show up at 8:45. We're really excited to have this conversation together. And the title is Out of Alignment, Conflicting Trends in the Governance of Advanced Artificial Intelligence. And we just started a conversation about the word alignment that we will invite you in. So the idea is to try to keep this conversational and informal and avoid long speeches. So we won't do a big opening remark by everyone. I'll just say a couple of words to contextualize the change, because since we submitted this panel, like many things changed in the world for the worse. Obviously, the U.S. administration and tech policy and regulation has become even more of a bargaining chip than before. I think we could argue, and especially in this room, because we talked about safe harbor and privacy shield for a decade now, I think we could argue that it has always been that type of bargaining chip. It's just more masks off right now. And even in Europe, when we see the discussions around industrial policy, economic growth over the rule of law and human rights, and that intertwined with the securitization agenda, that is definitely not a good starting point for a rights-based AI governance. And what worries me even more is that the deregulation around quote-unquote AI gets to a point when it touches the underlying fundamental rights legislative environment. And we used to operate on the basis that there's no proper AI governance, regulation, legislation without data protection, adequate data protection rules, and now that's even being questioned. While we are still in the AI hype cycle and many things are being built physically and in the governance world, but under what philosophies or on what values. And so the purpose of the session is to lay out a few of these driving philosophies and norms which are gaining or losing power, and to understand the different role of actors in this ecosystem, and what can we all do to bring back a rights-based governance to AI. So that's the purpose. And we'll start with an opening question to each speaker, and then we'll go to a more conversational style. So I will ask each of you just to give a short answer, one sentence, couple of sentences to the question: when you hear AI governance in 2025, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? AI governance has been a topic that's been on the agenda for a very long time, and it's been very vague and used for different ways, and I'm curious what it means for you now. And I'll start with Gerald, please. Gerald is coordinating senior at the Department for the Coordination of AI Oversight in the Netherlands, which is the authority to oversee artificial intelligence, and it's linked to the Data Protection Authority, but it's not the same. And so he founded this department in 2023, and the aim is to monitor the risks associated with algorithms and AI. And so what comes to your mind?
Well, AI and algorithm governance is something that we are discussing like on a daily basis, but it's sometimes a bit of a hollow phrase. So there's a lot of discussion about what is it exactly, what do we need to understand when we say AI governance, and in essence it's just doing the right thing, using your sense of mind, just doing sensible things, doing the things that need to be done. Just think about it. Know that you can prove what you say it's going to do, this system? Can you prove this? Can you tell us what the risks are? So it's something that's already like 50 years old, 100 years old. It's not new. The one thing that is new is the narrative around it. So one of the things that comes to my mind is, don't let yourself get distracted by existentialism, for example. If we are not going to let these systems roam free and develop as everyone wants, we are going to be destroyed by them. That's one narrative that no one can really prove. And it's something that's distracting quite a lot of people. Well, the problems are now, and the problems are being overshadowed by this narrative. We have to look at what is going wrong now, and what can we prevent in the future, and not be distracted by all these narratives from well, we all know where they're coming from, but don't get distracted by those.
Thank you. We'll come back to it, but now I would like to hear from Iverna, who is a rights advisor at the UN Human Rights Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR. It's an abbreviation that's hard to get right. And so, speaking of the problems, violations, and harms now, what's your association of AI governance?
Thank you, Fanny. I think you touched upon it a bit in the opening, and just to follow on, indeed, as a human rights lawyer, obviously when I hear the word governance, as it's been said, can mean so many things. But ultimately, governance speaks about the ecosystem. What are the laws, the company practices, the power dynamics overseeing AI? And from the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, what we're seeing in our work around the world at national level, regional and international, is that we need to go back to the beautiful basics, that we can't have abstract conversations about governance without starting at that piece of, now that AI is so omnipresent and being used in so many by public authorities, by the private actors in different ways, how do we ensure those core elements of human rights and fundamental rights are protected? And not only data protection, indeed, but human rights more broadly, till we start from that framework, because in any ecosystem, if those beautiful basics aren't there, then obviously you'll have difficulty with those power dynamics and that general piece of governance. So I think that would really be what comes to my mind, is to say, we can talk about governance, but let's start with the rights.
Thank you. I'll turn to Shazeda, who is a Chancellor's postdoctoral fellow at UCLA, and so she came from very, very far. Thank you so much for being here, and please tell us also.
So my one sentence would be, whenever I hear AI governance in 2025, I'm immediately listening for if the speaker has diluted the political stakes. My research has looked very recently at the community of people who say they work on AI safety, right? And I was trying to understand what are the ideas they're building this off of. As has been alluded to, they often will talk about existential risk from AI or artificial general intelligence that they believe will be sentient, smarter than humans. And I wanted to understand the scientific basis for a lot of their thinking. But what I've come to see over time is there is no scientific consensus around that set of ideas. As Gerald just mentioned, right, a lot of it is unprovable, untestable. And very early on, I started to notice that this became really influential in policy conversations. I think it takes advantage of fear policymakers have about not knowing every single thing about AI. It privileges technological knowledge as somehow being more important than social and political knowledge. And what has happened over time is a lot of the solutions that get proposed and called AI governance coming from that space are purely technical solutions and do not engage with long-standing political traditions and mores and norms. So we're in a moment where that is the process of dilution. And if I had to make a recommendation, it's that we always have to bring the social and the political back into these conversations at every opportunity we have.
Thank you. But I was just laughing because I don't know. We will try to make this sketchy, but there won't be a lot of disagreements, I don't think. There was supposed to be a couple of speakers from different AI safety institutes from around the world as well, but for different reasons they could not participate and talk about these openly, which I think is quite telling that, we were not asking secretive questions, but they were not able to speak publicly on deregulation or effective altruism, which is quite interesting. All right, so I'll go to you, Roel. Roel is the director of the Socio-Technical AI Systems Lab at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, and I would like to hear your AI governance take.
Yeah, thank you, and good morning, everyone. For me, the distinction I wanted to bring in, and think something I figured out recently, is that there's a sort of misunderstanding about what technical means. And I'm fully in line with what Shazeda said, that we have to keep bringing the social and the political back into conversations of governance. But when we're looking at safety specifically, that's always been the case. Safety is, by definition, not a technical sort of property that you can assign to a technical component, right? It's something that lives in between, the technical and the social. You have to look at organizational, institutional, political factors to understand safety or possible safety issues that might arise. And so the computer science, software interpretation is really like, okay, let's do technical AI safety. And it's become stuck in their technical terms, right? That's not about safety, and they're figuring that out at the moment. So the recent International AI Safety Report was purely focused on mitigation methods for safety around AI, particularly like the sort of general purpose AI. Then the other interpretation of technical is more the one that policymakers and politicians have. It's like, oh, we'd like to sort of hand over, we know what we want, and we can sort of hand it over to experts, right? And that's what I think often meant with what technical means in their language. And then I would say, well, if we can agree on that form of technical actually requires social, political, and all these other forms of experiential expertise, then we can look forward. So I'd like to do that a bit more in my contribution, is to look forward rather than, but take notice of the sort of state we're in, where technical AI safety is stuck in these sort of computer technical terms.
Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to continue, Gerald, then on this point of this definition or different definition, and how an authority tasked with acting on these violations and harms and risks, and just asking, like, I'm assuming that in this room people have heard of some of the Dutch scandals around social welfare and childcare benefits, and I'm just curious how the authority approaches this socio-technical nature of AI safety and accountability and the enforcement.
Well, it's quite a big challenge, actually. It's something that we're working on daily, but it's maybe good to go back just a bit. So in the Netherlands, we had a few scandals, actually, and we were one of the countries that were, I think, early wise. But we saw the effects that AI and algorithms can have, the negative effects, quite early. And we are not unique. I think a lot of countries are experiencing the same things at this moment. But one of the things that this did is it brought awareness of what it can do when you don't build in good safeguards, when you're not aware that this is a political decision, it's a societal decision to do this, and it's not going to change one element in like a whole chain of systems. It's going to change everything in the whole chain and even beyond. So the awareness is now there, and it has been there for quite a few years. The question is, what are we going to do? In the Netherlands, the government has done quite a few things. So we have a public algorithm register. still not mandatory, but there are quite a few public organizations that have put their algorithms in there. And it has brought something like a state of mind for a lot of organizations. And it's not, I'm not going to say that everything's going well, quite the opposite. But organizations are thinking about it. One of the other things that the Dutch government did after these scandals is saying, okay, we need to have oversight on human rights and fundamental rights and public values when it comes to development and use of algorithms and AI. And that's what the new department is in the same organization as the DPA, but we are not focused on data protection alone. We are also focused on a broader scope of fundamental rights and public values. And that's kind of the scope that we keep. So independence from what the definitions are. Are we talking about safety or security? Well, let's make it concrete. Let's operationalize it. What's the problem that's in front of us? What's the new system that we have to look at? And then we can discuss possible definitions, but first look at the fundamental rights that you have and look at the system or the problem or the effects that you see. And then we can discuss terminology and everything that's in between those two. But we have those 2 points that are set. We know what to do with them. The question is, how are you going to do this as an authority? Well, there's quite a lot that you can use. We can use jurisprudence and quite a lot of knowledge from fundamental rights agencies and equality bodies, for example, because infringement on fundamental rights, they're not new. The technology part is new, but the infringements are there. And the same goes for data protection. That's not new, and technology has played quite a big part in data protection for quite a while. So you can use those elements, and also we're working together internationally with other organizations, with academia, but also with the OECD, for example, to look at how can we categorize this, because we have a lot of miscommunications. And one of the things that we have contributed to, and we're happy that's now there, is OECD Incident Reporting Framework. And it's a reporting framework with 28 categories, where you can look at incidents, but also at systems that don't have incidents at all. And it's, what is the system doing? What is it saying that it's doing? How is it being governed? What is it being used for? What can possibly be a violation to fundamental rights? Okay, and how are they going to solve that? So it's a standard way of looking at this, and that's useful for us, but also for a lot of other organizations. So that's what we are testing and sharing with the other organizations to get kind of like a level playing field in terminology and categorization, and trying to do this, but at the same time just doing this. So we are publishing an AI and algorithmic risk report every 6 months. We are now at the 5th edition, and we're still one of the few organizations in the world that are doing this structurally. Just looking at things, just doing it, and maybe we will change the terminology in 6 months or a year or 3 years. But start doing this. That's kind of the best thing you can do now.
I have a quick follow-up question, because like my impression has been that in the past 5-7 years in particular, the entire technology accountability policy went into this documentation machine as a best case outcome for some of the regulation, and I'm curious of, in your experience in the past few years, and also like having change of government, do you see the documentation and the reports and the data and the proofs turning into change on the violation level, or the people who are experiencing these harms?
It's quite difficult to say, because a lot of people are still not aware that these harms may occur, or they only are aware of this when it already happened, quite late. So it's still very difficult to get a good grasp of how big is this problem actually, how many people are maybe involved in this. So that's difficult to say. When I look at it from a very positive angle, I can see that a lot of organizations use this documentation, all these documentation elements to create awareness, to try to get a grasp of these things, to try to get some kind of control. So that's a very positive angle. At a very negative angle, I still see a lot of hesitation. And I sat here, and well, not here, but at CPDP a few years ago, and I said we were talking about DPIAs, so the data protection impact assessment.
Yeah.
And I said, well, because everyone was asking, how should I do this? Give me the exact list that I should check off. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't care how you do it. I want you to do it. But you can write it in blood on the wall if you want it. You can make a video out of it, and they are still quoting this. But if other people can understand it, it's okay. I want you to be creative. I want you to be able to explain it to me. I don't care exactly how you do it. But you have to be confident enough and mature enough to be able to say, okay, this is how I'm going to do it. If you're not mature enough to make that decision, how are you mature enough to use all these complex systems that may infringe human rights? And that's still something that all this paperwork, that all this documentation hasn't really changed.
Okay, yeah. I mean, to bring that sentiment to a less violent language, but
Sorry.
but no, it's but the sentiment, I think, is right. Like, I was in Hong Kong for the then called ICDPPC, International Conference for Data Protection Commissioners. This is the annual meeting of all the data protection authorities, and companies publicly told data protection authorities that they want to have a top priority list. If they violate those, then they are in some big trouble, and give them the list, which is fine. And they were happily telling this in front of everyone publicly back in 2018. When was this? Yeah, so I hear the sentiment. Okay,
But the
yes.
list is fundamental rights.
No,
That's
I get.
my
I mean,
answer.
sure, yeah, but I'm sure some gave like the Irish probably gave them a. I mean, the DPA probably gave a list at the time. I don't know. So just going to Iverna for a minute here. So there is this. When we started at the beginning, there is clearly a human rights crisis on a norm level, on an institutional level, on every level. And I don't think that human rights laws were ever perfect. I think there was a very valid criticism from the progressive side that it was not meant to protect adequately collective rights, for instance. And there was a need to reform them. But what's happening now is clearly not a reform, and we're losing ground even on those basics that you mentioned in the introduction on the lowest common denominator. And originally, I just wanted to ask you, like, do you see a way out and get to a human rights respecting place for AI governance? And then I said, like, okay, let's rephrase this and say, like, what is the way out? Or even if it's a small step, but we need to. I think we've been in this shock for a while, and it's really time to come together and act. And I'm wondering what's the OHCHR's response short term.
Thanks, Fanny. Always the easy questions for me. What's the world's solution to? So, and thank you. It's a bit of an existential question, so I'll pursue myself a little bit of a broader existential response when thinking about this. That actually, human rights, it's never been easy. It's always been a point of that we've had to fight for. And human rights, in their modern concept, without getting too philosophical about its origins, but the Universal Declaration is actually only just over 75 years old, right? It's relatively new. My first work professionally in human rights was with the United Nations Convention on the Discrimination of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW Convention, and that's not much older than me. Which is obviously very young. But when that, as you mentioned, some of that human rights is imperfect, when that convention was originally drafted, they had no article against violence against women. That's unthinkable for us now. And now, I think, one of the defining pieces of our time has been, obviously, violence against women. So my point is that we have this generation, in many ways, digital rights, this is our frontier now. These conversations are happening now for the normative framework. The discussions obviously happening at international level, at national level. And there's also that point, like I said, that indeed it's not an easy time for human rights. And at the same time, it's never been. I've had the great privilege, having worked more broadly in human rights, to being at the periphery of, or a frontline witness to, moments in human rights where they said it was impossible. As you can tell by my accent, I'm Irish, and I remember the question of sexual reproductive health rights for women. That was seen as impossible in Ireland, and yet civil society came together, people mobilised, and it was possible. So I think we need to remind ourselves also that in this context and in this moment, that again, it's possible. In terms of digital rights, I do think there's a couple of concrete things, like you say, in terms of the way out. One is that we don't cede ground. It's not because people use different language or downplay human rights that we don't have them and we don't fight for them. The role of civil society is so important. So protecting civic space, we see again and again through our work at the Office of High Commissioner, if it's through debates on national regulation, international, when civil society have a meaningful seat at the table, we get better laws, better results, and more sustainable outcomes. Also for companies, less liability, so it really makes sense. So protecting civic space actively and, doing that, but also working across a broader spectrum of civil society. Years ago, this was a bit of a niche issue, right? It was digital rights organizations, data protection. Now we need all of these different movements together, whether it's on climate, whether it's on women's rights. Again, and I really like the point about the role of equality bodies, national human rights institutions. This question of how we handle the digital element has to be mainstreamed through all of our human rights protection systems, nationally, regionally, and internationally. I think that's the really, really important point for me.
And specifically the trends on AI governance and all the regulation, but also like the hype cycle for AI for good, and you can replace that term with AI for health, AI for sustainability, you name it, which is mostly business pitches. How do you see the UN structure being impacted by this trend? Because I can imagine that, let's say, the OHCHR has to fight for some of these ground rules, even with the ITU, who have a very different approach to technology. And do you feel like you have to hold even this basic line that the rights-based approach needs to remain, specifically in the AI context?
Yes, it's a really pertinent question. So as those familiar with the United Nations structure will be aware, there's 3 pillars to the United Nations, of course, human rights being one of them, but human rights gets less than 5% funding in the entire system. So it's extraordinary that we're technically a third of the pillar, but yet get so under. So that, and with all of these conversations, we mentioned which philosophies gain traction, but obviously which pieces are funded. So just to say a little bit in terms of what we're doing in terms of using AI ourselves, but then the first question of what's happening at United Nations level. So we had the Global Digital Compact, as people will be aware, that was agreed not so long ago. What was extraordinary, and you mentioned a backsliding on human rights, extraordinary given the challenge we have to get consensus, is that human rights is strong in every single chapter. And that was agreed, obviously, by all states of the world. And that's a real entry point and opportunity. So we have human rights across all chapters of the Global Digital Compact. Obviously, in relation to AI, we have the International Panel on AI and the Global Dialogue on AI. They're 2 pieces. Again, the negotiations for those pieces are ongoing. I think it'll be extremely important that the panel is independent, fully independent in terms of the experts, and we've seen the weight of the International Panel on Climate and the credibility that the United Nations systems can bring to these global conversations when done correctly, but those discussions are still ongoing. Equally, the conversation on the global dialogue on governance, the Office of High Commissioner will be called on, but again, we're smaller, but we'll be called on to inject human rights to that conversation. But the final piece that actually the Office of High Commissioner was mandated to do directly is this Human Rights Advisory Service for Digital Technologies. And that effectively would be ramping up the work that the Office of High Commissioner is already doing. So offering advice at national, regional and international level on how to really, inject the human rights perspective. We also had adopted the United Nations guidelines for the UN's use of technology. And it's really interesting because they've actually been taken up by a lot of international financial institutions and others, and increasingly by governments, because it is actually a due diligence framework for public use of AI. And you mentioned the ITU. Actually, that's an area I find really promising and exciting. The Office of High Commissioner is now very closely working with ITU on human rights and standard setting. As we know, this was an issue that was quite niche years ago. And, the upcoming meeting in Madrid, I think you'll see that there's been a lot of ground. We had a huge and successful side meeting that was attended by regulators from across the world to the AI summit in Paris that focused on standard setting and human rights. Again, the global summit in London. I was just really positively inclined in the context that we are, that that's an issue that's gaining traction, and that ITU, to their credit, proactively came and said, we need the Office of High Commissioner to really work hand in hand with us on this. And then finally, a very important point, and one that's close to my heart, the Office of High Commissioner also has a digital innovation hub, because as you mentioned, like all public organizations, we also have the challenge of using AI to carry out our work, but we have obviously a very high bar in doing so in an extremely responsible and effective manner. So our own hub is looking at, we have very valuable data that we know has been collected, with great care. So putting that data to use in terms of then signaling early warning for human rights crises. We've done very important work, for example, monitoring things like civic space, human rights defenders, etc. So really doing that piece as well, leading by example by using AI in public interest, and doing so in a way that will contribute in a meaningful way to what it means to use public interest AI, rather than, as you say, more in the hype of saying that we're using it for good, but in reality, it's a commercial interest.
Thank you. And I just wanted to just mention one tiny point for the room, because I think these weeks are another test that the EU will probably fail, as it has failed on many fronts, on foreign policy, in Palestine, for instance, but on many other fronts, like the Hungarian government introduced the legislation that will send the Hungarian NGOs to exile the same way as in Russia, because they will no longer be able to accept any funding from foreign sources, meaning like you as a citizen from another country, or OSF or European Commission, it doesn't matter. And there's a deep crisis right now in civil society and journalism there. But yeah, I just don't have much hope that the European Union institutions will be able to adequately respond. But coming back to the point, we were almost like giggling at the beginning about when we hear a couple of terms like alignment, safety, in addition to a bingo game. I notice myself how interesting when you talk to people and they use these terms, you immediately place them in a camp based on where your expertise is and what you know about people, and this is often extremely misleading, and the term is used in very, very different ways. And I know this is an absolutely impossible task, but could you just orient us a little bit on the language around safety, AI safety in particular? Sure.
So, as I was mentioning earlier, what we've come to notice is that the community of people who work on what they're referring to as AI safety has spun out of a set of ideologies. Some people call them the TESCREAL ideologies, right? Things like transhumanism, effective altruism, rationalism, long-termism. These don't necessarily make themselves apparent when they use words like AI safety, right? And something that I think is actually misleading now is, whereas 2 or 3 years ago when I met somebody who said they were interested in AI safety, I could probably reliably assume they think artificial general intelligence is possible. They will tell me about existential risk from AI, or the idea that society will be so suffused with AI systems that they could become misaligned from human values and lead to mass destruction. Those are people who usually don't have those opinions challenged when they're surrounded by other people who think the same things. But what I will say is that as that community has grown more influential, now you do hear people say, I work on AI safety, who don't know about that whole kind of ideological background, or who didn't read a lot of the same source texts and come up being socialized around the same groups. And so it becomes a little bit harder actually to place people. But this is still largely deregulatory, and that's something that when I hear people talk about AI safety, I almost always still know is true. Certainly, right, the promise around something like AI alignment. So for many years, alignment was like a purely technical term that, kind of largely could be construed to say you got a system to do what you defined you wanted it to do and not something else. But over time, this kind of AI safety community has come to talk about AI alignment as like the catch-all solve for every problem, SALV and SOLVE. And so what you see is this over-promising that you don't really need regulation if you have AI systems that are aligned to human values. If you look at a company like Anthropic, right, they were spun out of OpenAI and now they're their big competitor, but they're often quite similar. Like, Anthropic has this thing called constitutional AI, where they've trained an AI assistant to essentially place checks and balances on their language models and prevent quote unquote harmful outputs when people are put in prompts that ask for something that could lead to violence or fraud or other harms. And they think that when they developed their own constitution of values within that company, that was 3 people in that company defining what those values were and then building systems based off of them. A next iteration was they worked with a company that would find samples of people to fill out polls, right? So it was like a polling company, and they refined it using 1,000 people's kind of randomly sampled responses to questions. These are the mechanisms that could easily replace other forms of governance if we continue to let companies dictate and say, this is sufficient. This represents the public and the public's interest. What was so interesting about when I saw that work presented by Anthropic was they said, we would have to replicate this in every single country to make it work, and we don't really have plans to do that anytime soon. But I wouldn't be surprised if over time, when people continue to pressure these companies, this is the approach they'll end up taking. And so Fanny was talking about effective altruism earlier, and this is also a tricky thing right now where effective altruism was a kind of philosophical movement to come out of Oxbridge in the 2000s. And, these were philosophy students who were asking, how can we apply utilitarian philosophy to the real world? If we want the greatest number of human beings to exist hundreds of years from now, what would be the biggest threats to their existence and to their flourishing, and how can we prevent those threats from happening? So some of those are things that have already happened, right? Like nuclear wars or pandemics, certainly like global health kind of development issues, but increasingly they have been really focused on AI. And while that used to be a field that looked at all of those issues, there's been recent research that shows the primary one that makes the money and attracts people to the community is the AI issue. And so that's kind of why they come out, more influential on that than on the other things they work on. Increasingly, because there's been a lot of public scandals, right? Like Sam Bankman-Fried, who was a crypto billionaire and fraudulent, was like an emblematic member of this community. There's other issues we can raise around them. I think they're trying to obfuscate the connections between that community and those ideas and how they show up in policy spaces. And for people who aren't aware, this is like a really well-funded community. So they have their own major philanthropies and high net worth individuals. And because a lot of these people go off and work in the tech industry as well, that's money that flows back towards them. A lot of that money gets used to place people in civil service and government jobs in the US, in the UK, perhaps increasingly in Europe, but I haven't looked as closely. And so this has just become kind of hard to detect unless you know the keywords to look for. And over time, that language is going to change. So you actually have to understand the fundamental ideas because they are starting to co-opt words like democratic and flourishing and not mean the same thing in future. Yeah, future humanity. It's one that I see humanity now and I'm like, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of follow-ups. I think one area to look out for is definitely the funding crisis that is everywhere, which makes us all more prone to engagement with these actors, and it will be really difficult, to distinguish who is in for what, but also to say no to these relationships. So that was one thought that I had when you said the funding. And the other one on Anthropic, maybe in Anthropic that's still a plan, but in the meantime, OpenAI announced the partnership on Stargate to try to on behalf of the U.S. government, and it's really worth checking the public statement. It's quite something how they position the U.S. leadership in that statement, and not even trying to hide, but they're offering practically their services to countries, and on that note, just the follow-up question I have is, how do you see let's say, the fortunes of effective altruism changed with the Trump administration? Because I think that's not very clear from an outside perspective. There are so many logical proximity, and we see the tech billionaires, but there's also some friction, right? So I just wanted to ask if you can talk about that.
So we have an AI Safety Institute in the US government. What's funny is while they were being founded, a lot of people who come from a space of being critical of that field were very wary of oh, is this going to just be another depoliticized way of saying that you're regulating AI, but not really regulating AI? And we were watching who they were hiring. And the thing nobody could have ever expected is that you have Republicans like Ted Cruz who just have sort of painted a target on their back and decided, you know what, safety is the equivalent of wokeness. Couldn't be less true, right? This is a community of people who will regularly say things like, we don't care if AI discriminates against every single human being on the planet as long as we know we prevented it from killing them, right? They're really very clear about what their priorities are and what issues they don't take seriously. But because you have people like Ted Cruz and you have this conservative narrative in the United States that the tech companies lean liberal and they are censoring conservative speech online, it doesn't matter. It's actually kind of ironic, right? Every new buzzword, right? It was cybersecurity in 2015, and then it's AI. The Republicans attach the same narrative. It's oh, if AI is the new thing, well, AI is what the companies are using to censor conservative speech. And it doesn't matter that empirical research has documented it's actually the opposite, right? And that these platforms amplify this speech, especially when it gets kind of hateful engagement, because that's still engagement. And so that set of ideas has been attached to the word safety. And so I think what you see under the Trump administration is the treatment of safety as woke, even though it really couldn't be further from the truth, to the extent that, right, the UK changed their AI Safety Institute's name to the Security Institute. And I've had colleagues in the UK tell me they think that was a political decision to try to avoid, everything from tariffs to whatever other punishment Trump might want to inflict. I think it's such a reflection of how hollow some of this is that you can change the word and hope that you'll avoid the fire raining down on you today, but you're still doing essentially the same work, and it doesn't really have very much to do with kind of historic definitions of safety and security that predate this particular movement. The other thing I will say that's funny though, maybe on the surface their fortunes have changed, but beneath the surface, I would say they haven't. And it's not just because of the continuation of money, it's that there's a fundamental worldview there that doesn't actually challenge conservatism in the United States. Before I studied this community, most of the work I did was in China. Like, I speak Mandarin, I've done field work there for years, and I've watched as this narrative of a US-China AI arms race gets spun out of nowhere and used to justify undemocratic actions in the United States taken in the name of protecting democracy. But democracy is really just a cover for American economic and political dominance. And this EI community has long had a very narrow view of China that fits the AI arms race narrative. So what happened is they stepped in at the perfect moment where they could continue to say, China will build AGI first. That will make the world authoritarian. Therefore, the US has to build AGI first. When that becomes their political positionality and their policy platform, they're welcomed into a lot of these spaces, regardless of who is in power, Democrats or Republicans. And I think that's something they have going for them that nobody really calls out or recognizes. Like, there's always going to be money and support for that perspective, even though it's completely built on just fallacies.
Thank you. Well, there's a lot to unpack, and I think, Roel, you're perfectly placed to continue the conversation here. I mean, when I describe your work, I usually say something like you're doing AI safety in a proper way, but I don't, like, just for people who don't engage with this topic, but I can imagine that it's a really difficult space to operate within this terminology, but more than the terminology, like the actual work. And I would just like to hear how you would continue on to explain how you see safety and accountability in AI.
Yeah. Yeah, so I want to sort of underline all the points made about the crisis in human rights, the very sort of, I would also say, toxic politics around AI safety and AI governance, and the ideological battles that are on some sides very well funded, right, and sort of really blurring the kind of work we're trying to do. But then I want to turn this conversation a little bit more forward, even though it may be, I don't think it's utopian, but it's ambitious, right? So a couple points. First, technical AI safety does not add up to safety, right? There's some fundamental sort of misassumptions that are made in this more technical computer science community, many of which align with the sort of effective altruist movements. Others have moved in, as Shazida said. And this report recently that was led by Benjo had experts from, that were put forward by the UN, OECD, the EU, came to conclusions that we don't really have a consensus on what AI can and cannot do. Don't really have a good consensus on what the risks are, but the risks in the report are sort of like, there's a lot missing there. And the third is that the actual mitigation approaches to those risks, there's no single one that really works very well. And I think, as I said before, they only looked at very technical, sort of CS kind of technical approaches. And I already mentioned that that's really not how we've been thinking about safety generally, but also more specifically safety of software-based automation systems for decades, right? So there's a whole field of system safety that through the 80s and 90s has really looked at, okay, what's the role of software in safety critical systems as more and more new functionalities came up, but also more and more tasks were automated or decisions informed by, models and software and, measurement protocols, etc. The second point that I made before is that, technical in the eyes or in the ideal sort of sense for policymakers is, okay, can we agree on what we want and sort of how we go about this? Can we develop standards, as in the AI Act, the context of the European AI Act? And then, okay, how should, experts should help operationalize what we agree on? And here I would say, well, we agree on rights, right? We agree on fundamental rights. Let's put those front and center and try to sort of reclaim what safety, but also other things that we worry about when we're thinking about rights, what those mean. And system safety is then really, can be an important sort of, one important inspiration. It's not just about safety. The experts have also, the pioneers in this field have also shown that you can use these more socio-technical methods of understanding safety and then figuring out, okay, what are the factors that contribute to something being unsafe, right? It's not just the technical systems, but it's also the human beings working with technology, it's managers, it's oversight, it's also culture, right? You can do everything right in terms of safety, your safety protocols, your sort of systems of like figuring out, hey, there's something seems to be off here. We're doing some maintenance on the plane. There's some rust here on these components. This might be an issue. Like these are all systems that require a culture where, you know, if something comes up, there's a response to it, right? There's actual leadership. A lot of that is embodied and it's like relies on culture. All of that has been sort of, there's so much to learn from this, particularly then in this field of system safety, but obviously these things come back in other disciplines as well. And so, yeah, I guess some ways in which you can move forward with, if we look at system safety, we're not only can do a much better job at understanding safety and how AI works in context and how it leads to harms or unsafe situations and then to harms, which can also be rights violations. Obviously, many of the rights violations don't occur in the operational context. They occur in the sense that you know, people's data is used to train a system, right? We're still raving about generative AI systems that are built on stolen information. We don't know what data is used. My students are asking me, is it really true? Like first-year students, is it really true that ChatGPT is trained with, like, you know, all this information? I say, yeah, like my papers might be in it, like there's artists' work that's in there, writers, journalists, and I get these really big stares. I'm like, okay, so, you know, a lot of rights are violated, not just in the operational context, but in how these systems are being built, right? And then what a system theoretic or system safety discipline can also help us do is then to turn to the future and say, but what would we like to see in the future? And what's the gap between where we are now and where we want to go? And I think that's where in the end we need a lot more of the different communities coming together and sort of seeing, okay, what do I mean with safety? I've gotten a lot of pushback, as you said, like, well, you know, safety is sort of a tainted word, but also like, this is not about like how cars crash on the road, like autonomous cars crash on the road. This is about human rights. It's, well, there's a lot of expertise that we as systems engineers, for instance, can bring, and I can also bring your concerns back to the world of engineering to see how we can develop technologies differently. I think it's now really time to turn the page to sort of conclude, okay, the technical AI safety is stuck in technical terms. I think there's many people in that community that might want to do things differently, but let's also come together with those actors that I think have an idea of where we would like to go and yeah, turn the page and look forward. And then I'm very excited to see how we can sort of facilitate how you operationalize the rights-based governance. Even if there's very few resources, we can show it. Like we can give examples. And that's the power also, I think, of Gerald's team, that they're trying to do that already, and that starts up a conversation that can, you know, help us look forward, even though we're in very precarious times, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. Just looking at time, I want to make sure that the audience has time to ask questions. But is there anything you guys want to come back to, or what somebody said? Yeah.
Maybe just, it struck me that in terms of philosophy, this whole question, you know, we've seen it in some of the EU laws, for example, Fanny, where we have this, I guess, convolution between risk-based and rights-based, and a really fundamental confusion. And what I find interesting, you know, talking a little bit about corporate capture as well, the private sector, they have a certain language that they're more familiar with, like a risk-based approach to security, cybersecurity language, and I think there's also a conflation of these terms. But for me, the ultimate irony is that if you really look into even security policy, it comes back to the first principle of people being protected. And I think that's sometimes what's getting lost in this debate, is that there's a focus on an abstract concept of safety or security. And you mentioned, Fanny, Hungary, and something that the Office of High Commissioner is very concerned about, obviously, the LGBTIQ laws, but the notion of using facial recognition technology to identify crowds. So there, from a rights-based approach, actually, as our office has said, you should have a moratorium on facial recognition in that context, because the risk to people and privacy is so high. And I think this focus on security and safety, ironically decoupling that from people, is something that we really have to fight very hard to realign and insert back into debates.
I'm just smiling. I might bring Carolina in for a second, if you don't mind, because I was just the Hungarian example is the perfect textbook case what the AI Act is not missing. I think that's giving them too much credit. That like actively allowed to have a carve out for it. Like it's the whole point of what the government is introducing is they want to ban pride in Hungary, or they did, sorry, like, and the idea is that they will activate facial recognition to know who attends Pride or any demonstration or anything in the future. And there's still some debates about whether it's live or retroactive, but it's really like the perfect case for the loophole in the AI Act.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to respond to this, so what we've done, for instance, is a study on the childcare benefit scandal in the Netherlands, right? So, tens of thousands of households falsely accused of fraud. The role of statistical models in that is big, but also institutional racism, lack of leadership, lack of human factors in designing these systems. So it's socio-technical. That's what I call system. Sort of a systems, socio-technical systems lens on trying to understand all these different factors. And what we started with is talking with bringing safety, system safety, also engineering, but also a broader safety analysis, to talking with victims of this scandal or similar kinds of scandals, and then working our way back. And what I'd like to say is, yes, there has been sort of an adoption of terms that bring sort of real harms or rights violations to sort of more abstract terms, and that's being exploited. That's being pushed by certain actors, being exploited subsequently in how it's operationalized. But that doesn't withhold us from operationalizing those terms back to talking with people and analyzing and seeing what actually happened and building up the evidence, both to say, hey, this is fundamentally unsafe. This is how we interpret safety, security, but also if we want to build public interest AI technologies, this is, what we can learn from, in this case, it's childcare benefit scandal. And by the way, like, we now know that probably more than 3,000 children were taken from families that were falsely accused, right? So it's just lingering on. And I think, despite the fact that this governance and the way it sort of materializes is under attack from non-public interests, we have to work really hard, I think, to still work with it and complement it with other means to look forward.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, this is a really good example of how you can approach this from a legal standpoint. You can say, okay, but we have legislation, we have new legislation, we have AI Act, but this was already prohibited. You could have known that this was prohibited. It's the same in Hungary. I can't imagine that this is not prohibited under the GDPR, for example, or at the very least on the EU Charter for Fundamental Rights. I think it's a very contestable thing that they have done now. So, but still, they are doing this. So you can't always approach this from a legal angle and from a legal perspective. You also have to be able to create awareness in the whole of society, to involve the NGOs, other stakeholders, the public, to see, okay, well, what does society think of this? And how do we know what society thinks of this? And do we know what the effects might be? And can we educate society about the possible effects? So it's a much broader way of approaching this that we need from the systems perspective, but also from societal perspective, to approach this, and not just from a legal standpoint. It's a very important element, but it's not the only one.
I think it's quite telling that we reached a point that even on a panel that is very focused on these topics, we reached, and someone from a regulator says that it's about organizing and mobilizing and not the law. And I mean, in other spaces, I think that's the common narrative of a solution for the crisis where we are. But I think it's great that that's the thinking. So there's an underlying theme that came up is about deregulation and the risk and the rights-based approach, which is a topic I could stay on forever. But I want to make sure that we have room for questions. If there's, yes, please.
Anna Julia, a postdoc from Freiburg University. Many thanks for your very interesting insights. The first is maybe a kind of doubtful. Maybe I use this as better. Thank you. Comment on the question of don't get disturbed or distracted by the narratives that are in there. So on Friday I have a talk on the question of framing AI as disruptive, and I think it's maybe slightly more complex that these narratives have already triggered down in our laws and regulations. So this is, yeah, maybe I would be less optimistic about this, even though I agree. My question is as to the safety duo. So Anu Bradford, with her Digital Empires book, which you might all know, she has this kind of idea of kind of minimum safety definition, where she says, okay, we cannot find a global consensus about safety in a broad sense, as you talked about it, because there are rights in there and there are values in there. But would you say that this kind of minimum safety definition, AI that will not go and act on its own, let's say, does it exist, this kind of definition? Is there a minimum consensus? And my third point is about the rights question. How are we challenged as legal or human rights scholars by this approach of standardization? Is there not a logical difference between seeing rights, as maximum enjoyment of rights, versus standardizing AI and actually rights protection? Thank you.
Safety duo can be a good punk band,
There's a sort of queer kind of thing going on here, where we're wearing the badge of safety now in a sort of strange way because we have to reclaim it. Do you want to respond first?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that book, but I don't even really see the community I'm studying asking for a minimum definition. And even if it did come down to something like what you just described, AI acting on its own, they might call agentic AI. They're thrilled that we get to have that. This is like a term they talk about all the time. I just don't foresee a minimum definition coming out of that space. The other thing about standards versus rights, in the US over the last few weeks, the House, in trying to pass like a budget negotiation bill at the last minute, the Republicans had added a provision that would ban state level AI regulation for 10 years. And this is chilling because when Donald Trump won the election, I remember everyone who was trying to work on federal, like national AI policy thought, okay, well, especially those of us living in California thought, okay, great, we live in a state that actually does pass regulation and tends to influence other states and even other countries. That's what we have to put all our energy into now. If there were a 10-year ban on individual states passing any kind of regulation, we know there wouldn't be federal ones either, and so this would just be the end of that. And it's interesting to see where people are thinking about diverting their energies if something like that happened. Right? It could be organizing, it could be working on international policy, it could be on very grassroots building kind of public AI infrastructure. But what was so interesting is when I asked somebody I know who works at NIST, with the National Institute for Standards and Technology, what do you make of this? And I expected him to be incensed. He said, well, I work on standards, right? Regulations are not the only way to impose kind of guardrails, if you want to call them that. And I found that to be surprising as well. It's almost like at least in the United States, sometimes there's this feeling of you've already lost something now that they're proposing it versus knowing it's already a certainty. And that's kind of the space that I'm coming from.
I'll give a quicker sort of textbook response. But if there would be any sort of minimal version of safety from the system safety perspective, we understand it as an emergent system property. So it's not a property you can assign to your model, as you can assign it to a broader, also the operational context that I talked about, but even the broader sense that, managers and oversight, all have a role to play in making sure that systems, especially critical systems, are safe. And that means that, safe general purpose AI is an oxymoron, right? So let's, it would probably be strange for those of you who are human rights lawyers or others working on human rights to say, well, this is a rights-abiding general purpose AI, right? That's ridiculous. Like, why do we accept things like safe AI, safe general purpose AI? I mean, the pioneers in this field of safety would say this is really blasphemy. So let's adopt another minimum version. It's a system property.
Hi, my name is Yvonne. I work at a regional authority in the Netherlands. I have a question about how to bring back the people or civil society in the governance question, and if you have any best practices that you could point us towards, and then specifically for Gerald, if there are methods that you are thinking about, because from a personal perspective, I'm part of the, smartphone-free growing up for children movement, and I see in practice that there are really no mechanism to take any control over personal data questions for your children, or the way that they are being sucked into these algorithms. There are no mechanisms to take any control. All you have is like the public debate. And from a professional perspective, I'm working on an algorithm, a tool, Polis, a digital, it's an open source democracy tool, and we want to bring sort of the fairness of the machine learning behind it into the public debate, but also create some type of governance around it involving civil society. And I have like nowhere to look on how to actually do that. And then as you've mentioned in what you were saying, like I was really wondering, do you have any ways to bring the civil society discussion where you were saying like it's also about how this security affects us in our daily lives, and that actually makes it more real or somehow. So that's the question.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It can be difficult to take control from a society perspective, because in a lot of cases the organizations that are using these systems or developing systems have to be open for it. But there is one important link that's often overlooked. Article 35.9, I said from the top of my head, from the GDPR. It says that if you are mandatory to do a data protection impact assessment, you have to consult with the data subjects before about their opinions. Because if you are mandatory to do a DPIA, there is a level of risk there. And in a lot of these systems that we are discussing, it's there. So they are under this regime. So you have to involve citizens or data subjects or their representatives. And for a lot of these systems, you can't always find the individuals. So you have to look to NGOs, to representative bodies. And that's the perfect way of doing this. And even if it's not mandatory, you really have to do this, because how would you know what the risks are of these systems? And what the reasoning behind, if this is something that society can deal with, and if they find it okay. So that's one of the best ways to incorporate this, and often it's mandatory. But a lot of organizations are not doing this. And I know that a lot of NGOs are open for it, but they often don't get any requests for it. So, but it's a great idea. And I think this is one of the most concrete elements to make your way into the process. Yeah.
Thank you. Just briefly, maybe on the previous question as well. I don't want my determination to be confused for blind optimism. I think it's more the point that even the very challenging times, and there are very serious human rights situations in different parts of the world, but I believe that we have to be very, stoic and determined, as you mentioned, on this point about organizing and not ceding the ground, as I said in the start, not because we're told that human rights have been cancelled, that we'll give that up, because there's been movements for many years embedding that in our constitutions and our laws and practices to uphold. And on the question of standard setting and human rights, so just to be very clear, there's the legal scholar piece about the concern to say if this becomes a civil liability issue, where actually, because of the standard setting, with due diligence has been exercised, actually there's no, I understand that, but the work that we have been doing is actually about really getting, indeed, civil society in the door at ITU, in other places, and also reducing those barriers to entry to have those conversations, because the end game, as we know, standard setting has a big impact. So the problem previously had been a total absence of different voices in those conversations. So it's not to, say that it's the silver bullet or anything like that, but to say that there is actually progress now in opening those doors and having the proper conversations we need to have. How to bring back people, a very pertinent question. Obviously, it's not easy in the fact that we have a global issue of shrinking civic space, a profound crisis of funding for civil society organizations at the moment as well. But states, there is a right to participate in public affairs that the Office of High Commissioner reminds states of. Our office has developed guidance for states on how to involve civil society actors and practices. We actually hold the official mandate. The Office of High Commissioner, for example, has worked to improve access for civil society and processes around major conferences like on climate and others. So there's definitely a lot of tools and practices around there, but I think there's also the argument to build a political will and to make indeed the case that it just makes sense. It's really important to talk to victims, of course it is, but we should rather be trying to avoid that there's victims in the first place. And you avoid that by involving people before and in the design and considerations, rather than waiting for the accidents to happen, so to speak.
Thank you very much. We're at time, so I'd like to just close with one thought that we didn't explore because of the confinements of time and the panel. But I think we didn't talk about another oxymoron, which is AI within planetary boundaries. If it continues to run on fossil fuel and it runs on the extraction of raw materials and labor in global majority countries more specifically. And so I just want to invite you all to check out climate-related sessions throughout the program. And thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for all the speakers. It was really great to have you and talk. Thank you.
Thank you.